May 18, 1565. The Mediterranean dawn revealed a sight that should have ended European Christianity forever. Across the azure waters of Malta's rocky shores, 193 Ottoman warships stretched to the horizon, their red banners snapping in the morning breeze. Aboard those vessels, 40,000 of Islam's finest warriors prepared for what Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had promised would be his crowning achievement. Standing on the limestone ramparts of Fort Street, Angelo, Grandmaster Jean de Valette, watched through his spyglass as the armada that had conquered Rhodes, terrorized Venice, and swept the eastern Mediterranean clean of Christian resistance now focused its overwhelming might on his tiny island. He commanded exactly 500 Knights of St. John and 8,000 Maltese militia, against odds of nearly 5 to 1. Military mathematics said Malta would fall in a week. But here's what the Ottoman chronicles won't tell you. This wasn't just another conquest for Suleiman. This was personal revenge 43 years in the making. Before we descend into 107 days of the most brutal siege warfare in Mediterranean history, hit that subscribe button for Medieval Spirits. Because what you're about to discover is how 70-year-old Jean de Valette, with 500 knights, faced 71-year-old Sultan Suleiman's 40,000 warriors, 15,000 elite, janissaries, 64 bronze cannons, firing 768 50-pound stones per hour. How this was personal revenge. In 1522, 27-year-old Valette had helped evacuate Rhodes, humiliating 28-year-old Suleiman, who never forgot those defiant Christian banners sailing away. How Valette designed tiny Fort Street, Elmo with 120 defenders, as a deliberate killing ground, angular bastions, channeling Ottoman assaults into crossfire zones that would bleed Mustafa Pasha's army beyond recovery. How knights swam 400 yards across Grand Harbor nightly, bringing reinforcements. Fra Roberto de Eboli made 7 trips carrying ammunition, died on his 8th. How Street Elmo cost the Ottomans 8,000 casualties for 120 nights before falling June 16th. How 70-year-old Valette personally fought at the breach with a two-handed sword during the August 1st assault by 15,000 Ottomans. And how on September 8th, when Spanish relief arrived, Valette's combined sally destroyed the Ottoman army in 60 minutes, 3,000 Turkish dead versus 200 Christian, ending with 25,000 Ottoman casualties total against 250 surviving knights. This is how one old man's 43-year memory transformed a barren rock into Islam's graveyard. Now let's go back to May 18th and watch 2 septuagenarians settle a score that would reshape Mediterranean power forever. Picture this massive Ottoman fleet as it approaches. Each galley carries 200 men, their bronze cannons glinting in the sunlight. The flagship alone displaces 1,200 tons, mounting 64 guns capable of hurling 50-pound stone balls over half a mile. When the fleet anchored in Marsaxlokk Bay, the combined weight of men and equipment was enough to make the shallow waters visibly rise. Admiral Piali Pasha's naval expertise stood behind General Mustafa Pasha, veteran of a dozen successful sieges, commanding 15,000 elite janissaries who had never known defeat. Against this oceanic force, Valette had assembled what appeared to be a hopeless defense. Malta's strategic position made it the cork in the Mediterranean bottle control the island, and Ottoman fleets could strike Sicily, Naples, even Rome itself. The knights understood the mathematics of desperation. Their treasury held enough silver to hire perhaps 2,000 mercenaries for 3 months. The island's limestone soil barely supported 20,000 inhabitants. Water came from rainwater systems that could be contaminated by enemy action. But here's what makes this confrontation truly personal. 43 years earlier, in 1522, A young knight named Valette had helped humiliate Sultan Suleiman during the knight's desperate evacuation from Rhodes. The then 27-year-old Valette had personally commanded the rear guard that held Ottoman forces long enough for the garrison to escape with their weapons and honor intact. Suleiman, barely 28 himself, and hungry to prove his worthiness to succeed his father, had been forced to grant the knight safe passage after months of siege. The memory of those defiant Christian banners sailing away from his conquered island had festered in the Sultan's mind through 4 decades of triumph. Now, Suleiman ruled an empire stretching from Budapest to Baghdad, from Crimea to Cairo. At 71, he commanded resources that dwarfed any European power. His armies had shattered Hungarian knighthood at Mohacs, besieged the gates of Vienna, and turned the Mediterranean into an Ottoman lake. Yet, as Ottoman landing boats hit Malta's southern beaches on May 19th, something impossible began to unfold. Valette had spent 43 years transforming this barren rock into Europe's deadliest fortress trap. The Ottomans expected another Rhodes, a swift siege followed by negotiated surrender. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy who had studied every detail of their tactics, anticipated their every move, and prepared surprises that would cost Suleiman's empire far more than one small island was worth. The Ottoman landing force struck Malta's southern coast with surgical precision. By dawn on May 20th, Mustafa Pasha had established his beachhead at Marsaxlok Bay, deploying 8,000 janissaries in perfect formation, while sappers began dragging the massive siege guns inland. Valette stood on the ramparts of Fort Street, Angelo, his weathered hands gripping the limestone battlements as he studied the enemy deployment. At 70, the Grand Master had witnessed more sieges than any living commander, but the methodical precision of Mustafa's approach sent ice through his veins. The Ottoman general was systematically establishing artillery positions that would allow him to bombard all 3 Christian strongholds simultaneously, and Mustafa was about to make the first fatal decision that would strangle his entire war machine. Then came the decision that would haunt military historians for centuries. Instead of concentrating his overwhelming firepower on Burgu, the knight's main stronghold, Mustafa chose to begin with Street. Elmo, the tiny star fort commanding the entrance to Grand Harbor, with its 8 cannons and garrison of exactly 120 men under Captain Luis de Miranda. Ottoman military doctrine demanded securing one's flanks before advancing, and since Street, Elmo's position threatened any ships attempting to enter the harbor. What appeared to be sound tactical thinking was actually the first link in a chain that would strangle the Ottoman war machine. Here's what Mustafa's staff officers couldn't have known about Valette's defensive genius. Street Elmo wasn't meant to be defended indefinitely. The fort's angular bastions and carefully calculated fields of fire had been designed as a killing ground, a place where Ottoman assault troops would die in such numbers that the siege would become economically unsustainable. Every stone had been positioned to channel attacking forces into interlocking zones of crossfire. By May 24th, the Ottoman siege train had completed its deadly crescendo. 64 cannons opened fire simultaneously at dawn, their bronze voices echoing across the Mediterranean like thunder trapped in a stone bowl. The mathematical precision was staggering. Each gun could fire 12 rounds per hour, meaning 768 stone balls weighing 50 pounds each crashed into Street. Elmo's walls every 60 minutes. The limestone fortifications, 15 feet thick at their base, began to crack and crumble under impacts that struck with the force of modern artillery. Captain Miranda's 120 defenders crouched in the smoking ruins as stone fragments filled the air like deadly snow. The sensory assault was overwhelming. The crash of cannonballs striking stone, the screams of wounded men, the acrid smoke that turned noon into twilight. Yet, the fort's angular design was working exactly as Valette had planned. Cannonballs that would have punched clean through traditional round towers struck the angled bastions and deflected harmlessly into the harbor. What should have been a 3-day bombardment was stretching into its second week. But then, everything changed on June 1st, when Ottoman trumpets sounded the advance. 8,000 Janissaries emerged from their trenches in perfect formation, their white felt caps bobbing like a deadly sea as they surged toward Street Elmo's shattered walls. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Each Janissary had trained for 15 years in weaponscraft, siege warfare, and absolute obedience to orders. They had stormed the walls of Belgrade, Constantinople, and Rhodes. A handful of knights behind crumbling stone barriers should have lasted minutes. The first assault wave hit Street. Elmo's breach, like a human tsunami. What happened next defied every principle of siege warfare that Mustafa had learned in 30 years of conquest. Instead of overwhelming the tiny garrison through sheer numbers, the Janissaries found themselves funneled into a nightmare of crossbow bolts and Greek fire that turned their disciplined advance into a charnel house. By sunset, 400 elite Ottoman troops lay dead in the rubble for the loss of exactly 12 knights. The mathematics of attrition had suddenly, impossibly reversed, and Valette was just beginning to reveal his genius. The siege of Street Elmo entered its third week with the mathematical precision of a death clock. Each dawn brought the same ritual. Ottoman cannons thundered for exactly 4 hours, reducing more limestone to powder. Each afternoon delivered fresh waves of Janissaries crashing against the diminishing walls. By June 10th, Captain Miranda's original 120 defenders had been reduced to 80 effective fighters. Yet the tiny fort still flew its white banner with the 8-pointed cross of the Knights of Street John. Mustafa Pasha stood in his command tent studying casualty reports that made no mathematical sense. His staff had calculated that Street Elmo should have fallen in 5 days maximum. The reality staring back from blood-stained parchment told a different story. 3,000 Ottoman dead against 40 knight casualties. At this exchange rate, taking the main fortresses of Burgu and Sanglia would cost him his entire army. Here's where legend meets brutal reality. Each night, as Ottoman sentries watched Street Elmo's walls, dark shapes moved across Grand Harbor like water spirits. Knights were swimming the 400-yard channel between Burgu and Street Elmo, carrying fresh ammunition and reinforcements to the doomed garrison. The volunteers knew they were swimming towards certain death, yet they came anyway. Fra Roberto de Eboli made the crossing 7 times, each journey laden with Greek fire and crossbow bolts. On his 8th attempt, a Turkish arquebus found its mark. His body washed ashore at dawn, still clutching a waterproof pouch containing 50 gold coins for the defenders' families. But Valette's genius extended beyond individual heroism. Every night, the Grand Master dispatched exactly enough reinforcements to keep Street Elmo fighting, but never enough to significantly strengthen it. The fort had become a deliberate sacrifice, a calculation as cold as winter steel. Each Ottoman soldier who died assaulting those crumbling walls was one fewer man available for the siege of Birgu. Street Elmo wasn't being defended, it was being weaponized. The psychological warfare escalated beyond conventional siege tactics. On June 15th, after losing 200 Janissaries in a single morning assault, Ottoman commanders ordered something that violated every code of military honor. The heads of captured knights were loaded into cannons and fired into Birgu's central square. The message was unmistakable. This is the fate awaiting every defender. Valette's response arrived the following dawn. Turkish heads catapulted from Street. Elmo's walls landed in Mustafa's camp with surgical accuracy. The 70-year-old Grandmaster had just declared that 2 could play the game of terror. June 16th dawned with ominous silence. No cannon fire, no trumpet calls. Ottoman assault troops massed in their trenches like coiled springs. 8,000 men preparing for what everyone knew would be Street Elmo's final hours. Captain Miranda walked the fort's shattered ramparts, counting his effective defenders. 9 knights remained capable of fighting. 9 men against the cream of the Ottoman Empire. The final assault began at noon. Wave after wave of Janissaries poured through the breaches. Miranda himself died, sword in hand, at his cannon, cut down while loading grape shot into the muzzle with his bare hands. When the white flag with its 8-pointed cross finally fell, Ottoman casualties for Street Elmo alone numbered 8,000 dead and wounded. Mustafa surveyed his Pyrrhic victory from the smoking ramparts, calculating costs that made his hands tremble. If a minor fortress defended by 120 men could exact such a price, what would the main defenses demand? The Ottomans had won Street Elmo, but they had lost something far more valuable. They had lost the summer. With Street Elmo finally silenced, Mustafa Pasha turned his artillery toward the real prize. The twin fortresses of Burgu and Senglia commanded Grand Harbor like stone guardians, their limestone bastions rising 80 feet above the water. Between them stretched a floating bridge protected by a massive iron chain, allowing defenders to reinforce each position rapidly. What the Ottomans faced was no longer a single fort, but an interconnected fortress complex designed by the finest military engineers in Europe. Valette had spent the month of Street Elmo's agony preparing his main defenses for the storm he knew was coming. The bombardment that began on July 15th dwarfed anything Europe had witnessed. 100 Ottoman cannons firing simultaneously created sound waves that shattered windows in Sicily 60 miles away. The mathematical brutality was staggering. Every minute, 200 stone balls weighing 50 pounds each crashed into the fortress walls, with impacts measuring 15 tons per square foot. The limestone dust rose in clouds so thick that noon became twilight, and men fought with scarves wrapped around their faces to breathe. But here's what separated Malta from every other siege in Ottoman history. The knights weren't just enduring the bombardment, they were fighting back with innovations that would revolutionize fortress warfare. Mobile cannon platforms allowed defenders to move their artillery between bastions as sections came under concentrated fire. Underground tunnels connected every major defensive position, enabling rapid redeployment of reserves. Most importantly, Valette had distributed command authority among his knights, ensuring that losing any single position wouldn't collapse the entire defense. You're probably wondering how 500 knights could hold against such overwhelming firepower. The answer was about to be demonstrated with devastating clarity on August 1st. August 1st arrived with an ominous silence that made seasoned warriors check their weapons twice. At dawn, Ottoman signal flags fluttered from Mustafa's command post, coordinating the largest assault of the siege. 15,000 men would attack simultaneously from 3 directions. 5,000 Janissaries would storm Burgu's land walls. Another 5,000 would strike Senglia from the south, while 5,000 Turkish Marines would assault the floating bridge from galleys. The mathematics were overwhelming. Even if the knights fought with superhuman skill, they faced odds of 25 to 1. The attack began at 6 a.m. with a precision that would have impressed Alexander the Great. Ottoman trumpets echoed across the harbor as assault columns advanced in perfect formation, their scimitars catching the morning sun like thousands of deadly mirrors. The sound was overwhelming. 20,000 feet marching in unison, the clash of steel on stone as ladders struck the walls, the roar of defenders shouting orders in 6 different languages. This wasn't just a battle, it was controlled chaos involving more men than most European cities contained. And then Valette did something that defied all military logic. What happened next defied military logic. Jean de Valette, 70 years old and supposedly too frail for combat, appeared personally at Birgu's most threatened breach. The Grand Master fought with a 2-handed sword, his white hair streaming as he cut down Janissaries, who had never imagined facing their enemy's supreme commander in single combat. His appearance electrified the defense. Knights who had been falling back suddenly surged forward. Maltese militia who had been wavering picked up dropped weapons and rejoined the fight. Picture this. You're a Janissary who spent months watching these walls, confident in victory, You breach the defenses and suddenly face a 70-year-old man fighting with the fury of someone half his age, his sword carving through your comrades like they're wheat before a scythe. The psychological impact was devastating. If their leader fought with such fury, what hope did you have against his warriors? The tide turned in 17 minutes. Ottoman assault troops expecting to face demoralized defenders instead encountered resistance that grew stronger under pressure. The floating bridge held despite losing half its defenders. Senglia's walls remained intact despite concentrated bombardment. Most impossibly, Burgu's breach became a killing ground where Turkish elite died faster than reinforcements could replace them. Turkish marines swarmed aboard the bridge galleys, their boarding axes sparking against night steel in hand-to-hand combat that left no room for retreat. At the same moment, assault troops struck Senglia's southern bastion, their war cries echoing off limestone walls as defenders poured boiling oil from the ramparts above. By noon, 3,000 Ottoman dead carpeted the approaches to the fortresses, while night casualties numbered fewer than 200. The exchange rate remained catastrophically in the knight's favor, but the real shock came when Mustafa tallied his losses that evening. The assault had cost him 15% of his entire army in 6 hours. At this exchange rate, taking Malta would require losses that would cripple Ottoman military power for a generation. Standing in his tent, surrounded by casualty reports, the general who had conquered half of Europe made a calculation that would echo through history. He could take Malta, but the price would destroy the very empire the victory was meant to serve. The question was no longer whether the fortresses would fall. The question was whether Suleiman's army would survive taking them. August ground onward with daily bombardments and weekly assaults, each one grinding down both armies but always favoring the defenders. Vilette's careful rationing meant his garrison could hold indefinitely. Mustafa's supply line, stretched back to Constantinople, grew more tenuous with each passing week. By late August, the Ottoman general faced the nightmare every siege commander dreads. His army was becoming the besieged force, trapped between Malta's walls and the approaching relief fleet whose sails had been spotted on the northern horizon. As the September 8th sun reached its zenith, the impossible had become reality. The relief fleet of Don Garcia de Toledo stretched across the northern horizon like a constellation of salvation, 28 galleys carrying 8,000 fresh Spanish and Italian troops toward Malta's smoking shores. From the ramparts of Burgu, Vilette watched through his brass spyglass as the Ottoman army that had terrorized Europe for 4 months began its final frantic preparations. Mustafa Pasha faced the nightmare scenario that had haunted his dreams since Street Elmo fell. His siege army, reduced to 25,000 exhausted men after months of grinding attrition, now found itself caught between the anvil of Malta's fortresses and the hammer of Spanish steel approaching from the sea. The timing was impossibly perfect. As if choreographed by divine providence, Don Garcia's landing boats hit the beaches at Melilla Bay precisely as Vilette ordered his final gamble. The fortress gates of Burgu and Senglia swung open simultaneously, disgorging 600 knights and 3,000 Maltese militia who had survived the longest siege in Mediterranean history. These weren't fresh troops charging into battle, they were scarred veterans who had endured 15 weeks of daily bombardment, men whose eyes held the hollow look of those who had seen hell and survived to tell about it. What followed defied every principle of military science that Mustafa had learned in 3 decades of conquest. His army, positioned to assault the fortresses from landward approaches, suddenly faced attack from 2 directions simultaneously. The Spanish cavalry, 500 mounted knights, led by Don Garcia himself, smashed into the Ottoman siege lines, while the fortress defenders struck from behind. Picture this from an Ottoman soldier's perspective. You've spent 4 months staring at Malta's walls, confident that eventual victory was inevitable despite the casualties. Suddenly, you're being attacked from behind by Spanish cavalry, while the supposedly broken garrison pours from gates you thought would never open again. The psychological impact was devastating. Janissaries who had spent months staring at Malta's walls suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against an enemy they had thought broken. The collapse was total and catastrophic. In 60 minutes of combat, the Ottoman siege army that had conquered Belgrade, Damascus, and Rhodes disintegrated into a fleeing mob. The mathematics of rout were merciless. 3,000 Turkish dead carpeted the ground between the landing beaches and the fortress walls, while Christian casualties numbered fewer than 200. Entire companies of Janissaries, the elite of Islamic military power, died where they stood, rather than face the shame of retreat. Their white felt caps dotted the battlefield like fallen snow, each marking a warrior who had trained 15 years for this moment of disaster. Here's what the Ottoman chronicles tried to hide about those final hours. The retreat became a headlong flight that abandoned military equipment worth more than the annual revenue of most European kingdoms. 64 bronze cannons, each representing months of skilled craftsmanship, lay abandoned in their emplacements. The siege that was supposed to demonstrate Ottoman supremacy had become the empire's most expensive military disaster. Mustafa Pasha, the general who had never lost a siege, stood on the deck of his flagship as Malta's cliffs receded into the Mediterranean haze. The butcher's bill made grim reading. Of the 40,000 men who had sailed from Constantinople in May, barely 15,000 remained effective for future campaigns. The Janissary Corps, backbone of Ottoman military power, had lost 8,000 men, including some of their most experienced officers. More devastating than the human cost was the strategic catastrophe. The Ottoman Empire had expended its entire annual military budget, capturing a barren rock 17 miles long, then lost it again in a single afternoon. But the knights had paid their own terrible price for salvation. Of Vilette's original 500 knights, only 250 remained alive and unwounded. The Maltese militia had suffered proportionally higher losses, with entire villages losing their adult male population during the siege. The limestone fortresses that had seemed so mighty in May now resembled lunar landscapes, their walls pocked with thousands of cannon impacts. As evening fell on September 8th, the survivors gathered in the smoke-blackened chapel of Street Lawrence to offer prayers of thanksgiving. Vilette knelt before the altar where he had prayed every morning of the siege, his white hair singed by Greek fire, his hands still bearing the calluses from personally manning the cannons during the August assaults. The Grand Master, who had defied mathematics and military logic for 107 days, finally allowed himself a moment of human exhaustion. Around him, his surviving knights removed their dented helmets and battle-stained surcoats, revealing faces aged years beyond the months they had endured. The victory bells that rang across Christian Europe, that autumn carried news that would reshape the balance of Mediterranean power forever. Malta had held, but more importantly, the myth of Ottoman invincibility lay shattered among the limestone rubble of Street Elmo's walls. The news reached Constantinople on October 3rd, carried by exhausted messengers who had ridden horses to death, bringing word of the disaster. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, now 72 and feeling every year of his age, received the reports in his private chambers overlooking the Bosphorus. The empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Indian Ocean had suffered its first major defeat in living memory. More devastating than the tactical loss was the strategic catastrophe it represented. The Ottoman war machine, seemingly unstoppable for 2 centuries, had revealed a fatal weakness. It could be bled white by determined defenders who understood the mathematics of attrition. The immediate consequences rippled across Europe like earthquake tremors. Venice, which had been preparing to surrender Cyprus rather than face Ottoman wrath, suddenly stiffened its resistance. The Pope began organizing the Holy League that would culminate in the Battle of Lepanto 6 years later. Most importantly, the myth of Ottoman invincibility lay shattered. Christian commanders who had automatically assumed defeat when facing Turkish armies began studying Malta's defensive innovations with the intensity of theologians parsing scripture. Suleiman never recovered from Malta's humiliation. The Sultan, who had terrorized Europe for 46 years, died 3 years later while besieging the Hungarian fortress of Sigedvar, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated strain of empire and defeat. May 18th, 1565. 500 Knights of Street. John faced 40,000 Ottoman warriors aboard 193 warships in a confrontation that should have ended European Christianity. When the guns fell silent 107 days later, those same 500 defenders, reduced to 250 survivors, had achieved something far more dangerous to their enemies. They had proven that overwhelming force could be defeated by superior will, innovative tactics, and the kind of disciplined courage that transforms ordinary men into legends. The mathematics revealed a devastating truth. Street. Elmo's 120 defenders cost the Ottomans 8,000 casualties, buying time for the main fortresses to prepare. Valet's cold calculation sacrificing Street, Elmo as a deliberate killing ground, bled Mustafa's army beyond recovery before the real siege even began. So here's what you need to understand about Malta. The mathematics weren't just about force ratios or defensive innovations. They were about recognizing that personal revenge can drive strategy, that deliberate sacrifice multiplies defensive power, that a 70-year-old commander fighting at the breach inspires warriors beyond rational limits. Valet spent 43 years remembering his humiliation at Rhodes, designing Street Elmo as an integrated killing ground, coordinating swimming reinforcements across 400 yards of open water under fire. The August 1st assault, 15,000 Ottomans attacking simultaneously, failed because Valet personally fought at the breach with a two-handed sword, transforming psychological momentum at the decisive moment. 25,000 Ottoman casualties against 250 surviving knights proved that strategic patience defeats numerical superiority. Subscribe to Medieval Spirits and share this video so others understand how integrated defense systems multiply limited forces. Leave a comment telling me which modern siege best demonstrates Valet's principles: deliberate sacrifice of forward positions, mobile reserves, distributed command, and personal leadership at the critical point. Because here's the real lesson from Malta. Sometimes the greatest victories require sacrificing what seems most valuable to bleed your enemy beyond recovery. Valet designed Street Elmo to die slowly, bleeding 8,000 Ottomans for 120 nights. 4 months later, 250 surviving knights proved that force multiplication through tactical patience defeats any numerical advantage. Sometimes the greatest victories belong not to those who count their soldiers, but to those who make every soldier count.